Something major happened on Friday, January 16th, 2026, and it might be the biggest trade decision in North American history since NAFTA was signed 30 years ago. Here's what makes this moment so extraordinary. It's not about what was said in a press conference or tweeted at 3 in the morning. It's about what was signed in Beijing while Washington watched, and the shockwaves rippling through every boardroom from Detroit to Mexico City to the grain terminals of Saskatchewan, they're just beginning. Let me explain something fundamental before we go any further. For the past 75 years, North American trade has operated on one unshakable assumption: Canada follows America's lead. Not because Ottawa lacks sovereignty, not because Canadians don't have their own interests, but because the economic integration between these two nations is so profound, so deeply woven into the fabric of both economies, that divergence seemed impossible. We're talking about 2,500 miles of undefended border, $1.3 trillion in annual trade, supply chains that cross the border 7, 8, sometimes 10 times before a single product reaches a consumer. That's not just trade policy. That's economic architecture. And on Friday, in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney took a sledgehammer to that architecture. Let me paint the scene for you. It's early morning in Washington, still dark outside, when the news starts filtering through. Canadian Prime Minister meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping. First visit by a Canadian leader to Beijing in 8 years. This was after a diplomatic freeze that began when Canada arrested Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou back in 2018, when China retaliated by detaining two Canadian citizens, when relations cratered so completely that trade became a weapon and trust evaporated. All of that history was sitting heavy in the room. Nobody expected a breakthrough. Nobody expected headlines. What everyone expected was symbolic gestures, vague promises, the usual diplomatic choreography that produces nothing but photo opportunities. What they got instead? A comprehensive trade agreement that fundamentally reorients Canada's economic future. And here's where this gets interesting. Here's where the agricultural component becomes absolutely critical to understanding what just happened. The primary agricultural commodity at the center of this deal isn't wheat, it's canola. But that distinction matters less than you might think, because what we're really talking about here is Canada's entire agricultural export strategy. And wheat is absolutely part of that larger picture. Canadian farmers export more than 8 million tons of grain to the United States every year, worth nearly 9.5 billion Canadian dollars. Wheat, canola, barley, pulses, all of it moving south across the border in a supply chain so efficient, so reliable, that most Americans never even think about where their flour comes from. But here's what happened over the past year that nobody was paying enough attention to. China, Canada's second largest agricultural market, imposed devastating tariffs on Canadian canola. We're talking tariffs that reached 84%. 84%. For perspective, that doesn't just make Canadian canola less competitive in Chinese markets. It makes it economically impossible to export. 40,000 Canadian canola farmers, thousands of workers in processing facilities, entire rural communities in Saskatchewan and Alberta that depend on agricultural exports. They got cut off overnight. Their second biggest customer just vanished. And where was the help? Where was the trade support? Where was the diplomatic intervention that might have eased those tariffs and restored market access? Washington was too busy imposing its own tariffs. Trump's administration, in its second iteration, has been even more aggressive than the first round. Steel tariffs, aluminum tariffs, threats to walk away from the USMCA entirely. And when Carney came to Washington looking for relief, looking for some recognition that Canada is America's largest trading partner and maybe, just maybe, deserves to be treated differently than China or the European Union, what did he get? Nothing. Worse than nothing. He got Trump calling for Canada to become the 51st state. He got public humiliation dressed up as negotiating strategy. So Carney did what any leader would do when their biggest market becomes unpredictable and their second biggest market slams the door. He went looking for alternatives. Here's what the deal entails. And pay close attention because the details matter enormously. Canada agrees to slash its tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% down to just 6.1%. That's a massive reduction. In exchange, China commits to cutting tariffs on Canadian canola seed to approximately 15% by March 1st, down from 84%. That's the kind of tariff reduction that doesn't just restore trade, it supercharges it. Canadian canola farmers went from being completely locked out of the Chinese market to having preferential access. Billions of dollars in exports suddenly viable again. Rural communities that were staring at bankruptcy suddenly have a lifeline. But the EV component? That's where this gets geopolitically explosive. Under the agreement, China can export up to 49,000 electric vehicles per year into Canada at the reduced tariff rate. And before you think that's a small number, consider this. That quota nearly matches pre-tariff import levels. Carney isn't cracking the door open for Chinese EVs. He's swinging it wide. And he's doing it precisely at the moment when the United States has imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, specifically to keep them out of the North American market. Trump's response to all of this? Publicly, surprisingly measured. When asked about the deal on Friday, Trump told reporters, that's what he should be doing. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that. Almost supportive, almost understanding. But that public facade lasted about as long as it took for his cabinet members to start talking. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer warned that Canada would regret the decision. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy said bringing Chinese cars into the Canadian market was a mistake. The message was clear. Trump himself might be willing to shrug this off, but his administration sees this as a direct threat to American interests. Here's why this matters so profoundly for supply chains. Not just in automotive, not just in agriculture, but across every sector of the North American economy. The USMCA, the trade agreement that replaced NAFTA back in 2020, comes for mandatory review on July 1st, 2026. That's less than 6 months from now. And Trump has already said the agreement is irrelevant. He's floated the idea of walking away entirely, of negotiating separate bilateral deals with Mexico and Canada, of fundamentally restructuring North American trade relationships. That uncertainty alone is causing companies to delay investments, to hold off on expansion plans, to build inventory buffers in case the entire system collapses. Now add Carney's China deal into that equation. The auto industry is particularly vulnerable because vehicle manufacturing in North America isn't contained within any single country. A car assembled in Michigan might have an engine built in Ontario, a transmission from Mexico, electronics from Texas, and interior components from Quebec. Parts cross borders multiple times during production. The entire system is built on the assumption of frictionless movement. No tariffs, no delays, no surprises. Chinese EVs entering Canada through this new agreement represent a wild card that nobody in Detroit or Washington knows how to calculate. Will those vehicles stay in Canada? Will they leak across the border into the U.S. market despite tariffs? Will Chinese manufacturers use Canada as a backdoor to establish North American assembly operations? And most critically, if Trump decides to retaliate by imposing new tariffs on Canadian automotive exports, does the entire integrated supply chain that produces millions of vehicles annually just stop working? The automotive sector alone represents $30 billion in annual trade between Canada and the United States. 300,000 jobs in Canada directly tied to auto manufacturing. Another million jobs indirectly connected through parts suppliers, logistics, dealerships, maintenance. When trade experts talk about supply chain paralysis, this is what they mean. It's not that trucks stop rolling or factories shut down overnight. It's that the uncertainty itself, the not knowing whether the rules that governed yesterday's shipment will still apply to tomorrow's, that uncertainty freezes decision making. Companies can't plan. They can't invest. They can't commit to long term contracts when the entire regulatory framework might change in 6 months. And agriculture faces the exact same crisis. Canadian grain farmers export to the United States because the supply chain makes it logical. Storage facilities on both sides of the border, rail networks that move seamlessly across provinces and states, processing facilities that can handle Canadian wheat alongside American crops without batting an eye. Bread baked in New York might contain flour milled in Buffalo from wheat grown in Manitoba that was stored in a Saskatchewan elevator before being shipped on Canadian Pacific Railway cars through Montana. That's not trade in the abstract. That's physical infrastructure built over decades, optimized for efficiency. What happens if Trump decides that Carney's China deal represents a betrayal and slaps retaliatory tariffs on Canadian agricultural imports? What happens to those grain elevators, those rail cars, those processing facilities that were built assuming open borders and predictable trade? They don't just become less efficient. They become stranded assets. Billions of dollars in infrastructure suddenly worthless because the economic assumptions that justified their construction no longer hold. And here's the thing nobody in Washington seems to fully grasp. Carney didn't make this decision because he wanted to pivot toward China. He made it because Trump left him no choice. When you're the leader of a country that sends 75% of its exports to a single market, and that market becomes unpredictable, hostile, led by someone who sees trade as a zero-sum game where one side wins and the other loses, you have to find alternatives. It's not ideology, it's survival. Canadian canola farmers needed markets. They needed buyers. They needed someone, anyone, willing to purchase their product at prices that wouldn't bankrupt entire communities. Trump wasn't offering that. His administration was too busy imposing tariffs, too focused on domestic politics, too convinced that economic pressure would force Canada into submission. So Carney went to Beijing, and Xi Jinping, who has been watching American trade policy alienate partner after partner, saw an opportunity. This is exactly what China has been trying to accomplish for years. Beijing's long-term strategy isn't to defeat the United States militarily or to out-innovate Silicon Valley, though they're certainly working on both. The real strategy is to fracture American alliances, to drive wedges between Washington and its traditional partners, to create a world where countries feel like they have to choose between the American orbit and the Chinese sphere of influence. And Trump, with his tariffs and his threats and his complete disregard for the value of stable, predictable trade relationships, is handing China those opportunities on a silver platter. Edward Alden at the Council on Foreign Relations called Carney's move a huge declaration of realignment in Canada's economic relations. He's right, but it's bigger than that. It's a signal to every American ally that the old assumptions no longer hold. The assumption that America will support its friends. The assumption that economic integration with the United States provides security and stability. The assumption that Washington will act in ways that consider the interests of its partners and not just its own narrow political calculations. All of that is breaking down. Not because Carney wants it to, because Trump's policies are making it impossible to maintain. And the supply chain implications ripple outward from there. The European Union is moving forward with a trade pact with Mercosur, the South American alliance that includes Brazil and Argentina. India is in active negotiations with multiple partners to diversify away from American markets. Mexico, which actually surpassed Canada as America's top trading partner in recent years, is watching all of this very carefully, running its own calculations about whether alignment with Washington still makes economic sense. you start to see the pattern. Trump's trade war, which he presents as a strategy to bring jobs back to America and revitalize domestic manufacturing, is actually pushing America's trading partners into the arms of competitors. And once those new trade relationships are established, once Canadian farmers are selling to China instead of America, once European companies are sourcing from South America instead of North America, once those supply chains are reconfigured, they don't just snap back into place when the political winds shift. Infrastructure gets built, relationships get established, contracts get signed, and suddenly the American market isn't as dominant as it used to be. Now, let's talk about what happens next, because the timeline is compressed and the stakes couldn't be higher. The USMCA review begins in July. 6 months. In trade policy terms, that's not just fast, it's breakneck. Normal trade negotiations take years. The original USMCA negotiation took 2 years of intense back and forth, and that was with all parties largely agreeing they wanted a deal. This time, Trump has already said the agreement is irrelevant. Carney has just demonstrated Canada is willing to look elsewhere. Mexico is caught in the middle, trying to maintain relationships with both northern neighbors while dealing with its own domestic pressures. What could the review produce? Best case scenario. All three countries agree to extend the agreement for another 16 years with minimal changes. Trade continues, supply chains remain intact, businesses can plan with confidence. But that requires Trump to back down from his maximalist rhetoric. Requires Carney to feel like Canada got a fair deal. Requires Mexico to thread the needle between American demands and its own interests. Given everything we've seen over the past year, that outcome seems unlikely. More realistic scenario. Negotiations drag on for months, maybe years. The agreement continues in 1-year increments while talks proceed, creating exactly the kind of uncertainty that paralyzes investment. Companies can't make long-term plans when they don't know what the trade rules will look like next year. So they hold cash, they delay expansions, they hedge, and the economy slows. Worst case scenario, Trump pulls out. The agreement collapses. We revert to pre-NAFTA trade relationships, which means tariffs return across the board. Not the targeted tariffs we're seeing now, comprehensive duties on virtually everything. The automotive industry, which has built its entire North American operation around integrated supply chains, would face catastrophic disruption. Agriculture would see market access vanish overnight. Manufacturing would scramble to reconfigure production networks that took decades to optimize. It would be, without exaggeration, the most significant blow to the North American economy since the Great Depression. And here's the cruel irony. Trump thinks he's playing hardball. He thinks tariffs and threats and economic nationalism are making America stronger. What he's actually doing is weakening the alliances that made American economic dominance possible in the first place. The post-World War II order, the system of treaties and trade agreements and mutual commitments that allowed American companies to build global supply chains and American workers to access products from around the world at reasonable prices. That system depended on trust. It depended on the belief that America would act predictably, would honor its commitments, would consider the interests of its partners. Trump is burning that trust, and Carney's China deal is just the latest piece of evidence that the burn is accelerating. When America's closest ally, the country that shares a 2,500-mile undefended border, decides that Beijing is a more reliable partner than Washington, something fundamental has broken. But let's bring this back to the specific question that paralysis creates. When we talk about supply chains being paralyzed, what does that actually mean for regular people? Because this isn't just abstract economic theory. This affects prices at the grocery store. It affects whether your car gets repaired on time. It affects whether the manufacturer in your town stays open or closes and moves operations overseas. It affects whether the farmer down the road can sell this year's harvest or has to plow it under because there's no buyer. Canadian wheat and grain exports to the United States, those 8 million tons I mentioned earlier, they don't just disappear if tariffs get imposed or if relationships deteriorate. The wheat still exists. The farmers still need to sell it. But suddenly, they're looking for new buyers, new supply chains, new logistics networks. And while they're searching, prices spike on the American side because domestic production can't immediately replace Canadian imports. Bread gets more expensive. Cereal prices climb. Bakeries face higher costs and either raise prices or cut staff. If Canadian auto parts suddenly face tariffs, American assembly plants either pay more or find new suppliers. But you don't just snap your fingers and replace suppliers that have been integrated into your production system for decades. New suppliers need to be vetted, qualified, tested. Their components need to meet specifications. Their delivery schedules need to sync with production timelines. All of that takes months, maybe years. Meanwhile, production slows. Models get delayed. Prices increase. Workers get furloughed. This is what supply chain paralysis looks like. It's not a single catastrophic event. It's 1,000 small disruptions, each one individually manageable, but collectively overwhelming. It's the death by 1,000 cuts that happens when the predictable becomes unpredictable, when the reliable becomes questionable, when the partners you counted on start making other plans. And Carney's decision to strike a deal with China, controversial as it might be in Washington, makes perfect sense when you understand the position he's in. He's leading a country of 40 million people, sitting next to a country of 330 million that's becoming increasingly erratic in its trade policy. He can't just hope Trump changes his mind. He can't just wait for American politics to stabilize. He has farmers who need markets today, workers who need jobs today, communities that need economic activity today. So he went to Beijing, he made a deal, and now the entire North American trade system has to recalibrate around that new reality. The question that keeps me up at night, the question that should be keeping every supply chain manager and every trade policy expert awake, is whether this is reversible. Can these relationships be repaired after the damage Trump has done? Can Canada be convinced to prioritize the American market again if a future administration takes a different approach? Can the supply chains that are being reconfigured right now be reconfigured again in a few years if political winds shift? I don't know. Nobody knows. What I do know is that trust, once broken, is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild. And Trump has been breaking trust systematically for years now, with Canada, with Mexico, with Europe, with Asian allies. Every time he imposes tariffs without warning, every time he threatens to walk away from agreements, every time he treats trade as a weapon rather than a tool for mutual prosperity, he's telling America's partners they can't count on us. And so they're finding new partners. Carney found China. Europe is finding South America. The world is reorganizing itself around the assumption that America can't be relied upon. And when the supply chains finish reconfiguring, when the new trade relationships are fully established, when the infrastructure gets built to support these alternative networks, we're going to wake up one day and realize that American economic dominance, the thing we've taken for granted for 75 years, has quietly slipped away. That's the real story behind Carney's China deal. It's not about electric vehicles or canola tariffs or any single commodity. It's about the slow-motion collapse of the economic order that made American prosperity possible. And Trump, with his tariffs and his threats and his complete inability to see beyond the next news cycle, is accelerating that collapse every single day. The supply chains aren't paralyzed yet, but they're seizing up. Every company that delays an investment decision because they don't know what the trade rules will look like next year, that's paralysis. Every farmer who can't commit to planting decisions because they don't know if they'll have market access, that's paralysis. Every manufacturer who's building excess inventory as insurance against supply disruptions, that's paralysis. It's happening right now, all around us, and most people won't notice until it's too late to stop it. So when you see headlines about Trump and Carney and trade deals with China, understand what you're really looking at. We're watching the architecture of global commerce being redrawn. You're seeing supply chains that took generations to build being dismantled in months. You're witnessing the moment when America's closest allies decided they needed backup plans because Washington had become too unreliable. And that wheat, that canola, those agricultural exports that connect Canadian fields to American tables, they're just one visible thread in a system that's coming apart. Pull that thread, and you start to see all the others. Pull those, and the whole thing unravels. The paralysis is real. The consequences are coming. And 6 months from now, when the USMCA review begins, we're going to find out whether the damage can be contained or whether we're past the point of no return. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening behind the headlines, what's really at stake in these trade negotiations, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Because this story is far from over, and I'll be tracking every development as we head toward that July review. Drop a comment below. Do you think Trump's trade strategy is strengthening America or pushing our allies away? I'm genuinely curious what you think, because this moment right now might be the inflection point where everything changes.